Dan has served as an executive director of AASA, the School Superintendents Association, since July 2008. He has more than 36 years of experience in public education. 27 years of those years he has served as a school superintendent. Prior to joining AASA, Dan served as a senior vice president for the National Urban Markets with McGraw-Hill Education. In this role, he was responsible for building strong relationships with large school districts nationwide. As an AASA member since 1979, Dan has also served as president of AASA from July 1998 to June 1999. He is also a past president of the New York State Council of School Superintendents, the Suffolk County Superintendents Association, and the Suffolk County Organization for Promotion of Education. He was also the first president and co-founder of the New York State Association for Bilingual Education. So Dan, we are so pleased to have you join us this afternoon. Let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Honor, and it's a pleasure to have all of you participating this afternoon. What I intend to do during the time that we have together is to share with you, from my experiences, the kind of relationships, the kind of activities that build effective principal-superintendent relationships, and that is so critical. I have to tell you, as you heard from Honor as she was introducing me, that I was a superintendent for 27 years. And that happened in four different organizations, four different districts. The first district that I was in was Deer Park, Long Island. And Deer Park was a typical size school district for the United States. I had in that school basically two primary centers, an intermediate school, a middle school, and a high school. So I had a total of 5 principals. And right from the get-go, it became very apparent to me that the key person that I needed to work with on my team was the school principal. That the leadership that the school principal would bring to that school would really determine the kind and the quality of education that would be taking place there. So with just 5 principals, it was relatively easy for me to begin establishing and fashioning the kind of relationship that I wanted to have with my principals. And it was a very close relationship, as you can imagine, one superintendent with 5. From Deer Park, I moved on to the South Huntington School District, which was about double the size of the Deer Park District. And there, I was working with 11 principals now. And here again, I sought to establish the same kind of close relationship with them. And by close, I mean that I would, on a monthly basis, designate one of the schools, and I would go to the school, and so would all of the other principals, and we would meet in that principal's office. And we would talk about the issues that were important in the district from their perspective and certainly from mine. My next move was to a much larger organization in New York State. There's an organization called the BOCES, the Board of Cooperative Educational Services. And within the BOCES, I actually had responsibility for 18 school districts. So now the numbers, as you can imagine, escalated significantly from the initial 5 and the initial 11. But my last superintendency was in Fairfax County, Virginia. Fairfax County is the 10th largest school district in the country with well over 190,000 students and upwards of 240 school facilities. So you can imagine how was I about to try to develop the kind of relationship with my principals that I had in Deer Park and South Huntington and to some extent at the BOCES. Well, I did the best that I could, and I still wanted to have the monthly meetings. So even in Fairfax County, I would have monthly meetings with all of my elementary principals, which numbered close to 200. I would have meetings with all of my middle school principals, which were 26, and I would have meetings with all of my high school principals, which were also 26 on a regular basis. So it was important to me to have the kind of communication and the kind of relationship with our principals that made a difference. Now here at AASA, where I've been the executive director for the past 10 years, we've done a lot of work recently with the Wallace Foundation. And you may be aware that the Wallace Foundation has done a lot of research and a lot of programs that focus on principal development, principal leadership. And so some of the things that I'm going to refer to today have to do with that work that the Wallace Foundation has done. Here you have on a screen one of their most recent, the School Principal as Leader, Guiding Schools to Better Teaching and Learning. And in this particular document, there are basically 5 points that are mentioned that are important to that element of the principal and the superintendent working closely together. So we're going to cover these throughout the presentation. There are 5 of them. And the first one, as you see, is the shaping a vision of academic success for all students based on high standards. And the next one is creating a climate hospitable to education in order that safety, a cooperative spirit, and other foundations of fruitful interaction prevail. The third one is cultivating leadership in others so that teachers and other adults assume their parts in realizing the school vision. The fourth one is improving instruction to enable teachers to teach at their best and students to learn to their utmost. And the last one is managing people, data, and processes to foster school improvement. I want to take these 5 and relate them to how, when the superintendent and the principal are working together, these things can happen. These points can be realized. So let's talk about the first one, sharing a vision of academic success for all students. And then another one of the points that I've blended together, improving instruction, because I really think that these 2 elements go together. You know, back in 1902, of course, we know that the Wright brothers were the first to fly a plane. It was some years back that I had the opportunity to attend an AASA event, of all things, that was being sponsored at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. And at the base, they had a museum. And those of you that are from the Washington, D.C. area may be familiar if you've ever gone to the Space Museum, where they have all of these vintage airplanes going back to the Wright brothers. And that evening at the Wright-Patterson facility, we had a dinner. And the dinner was held on the floor of the museum center. And there we sat between one of the original Wright brother planes and a modern airplane. And as we sat there and we looked at the difference between the Wright brother plane in 1902 and this modern jet now from the 21st century, it became apparent tremendous growth and tremendous advances and tremendous change had taken place over the course of those 100 and some years. And so when we think of that relative to education, here's the other thing that struck us when we were at that meeting. The following day, we actually went into the local town, and there they had the original schoolhouse dating back to the same time period as that Wright brother plane. And that schoolhouse was basically that one-room schoolhouse where all of the desks were planted on the floor, facing the front of the room where there was a chalkboard and where the teacher did the teacher's work. When you think of what happened in that 100-year period and education as we know it today, with the fact that the classroom today may be arranged in a different way, the reality is that not much has changed. We certainly have not seen the dramatic changes that we saw in going from the Wright brother craft to spaceships that we basically have today, the space shuttles, for example. So that's by way of saying that as the superintendent and the principal begin this process of working together in terms of moving forward and realizing the goal to provide the best possible instruction for our children, we are, even though in the 21st century, still very much a 20th century institution. What can we possibly do about that? Well, this is where that conversation between principal and superintendent become important, because it's an opportunity for the principals and the superintendent together to begin to fashion the vision and the mission for the kind of instructional programs that we want in our schools to ensure that we really are providing our students with the best possible education. And one of the things that we're very much aware of today, and we hear quite a bit about today, is this concept of competency-based education, which is really all about personalization. It's really about providing each and every student with the kind of instruction that is specific to that student and to their particular needs. And even more important, that the movement of those students, the progress of those students, is based on achieving competency as opposed to just being moved along. And we'll talk a little bit more about the significant difference between what competency-based education, a personalized program, is like, and how it differs significantly from the kind of education that goes on in our classrooms most of the time. For example, learning at your own pace is part of a personalized competency-based program, as opposed to the pacing guides that are so prevalent in our schools. I have, and I'm very proud of my youngest daughter, who's a sixth grade teacher. She just finished her third year as a sixth grade teacher. And at the sixth grade level, she teaches math and science. And I remember her first year that I was into the classroom. Of course, I have tried to influence her as much as I could, doing what I do and knowing what I know relative to her being in the classroom. And I remember her coming to me one day and saying, "Dad, I'm very frustrated." And I say, why, honey? What's the problem? She says, "Well, we have these pacing guides in place. And I have my math coordinator in the school coming into my classroom and looking at what we're doing and saying, 'Jillian, you're not keeping up with the pacing guide.'" Now, here's why Jillian felt this frustration. She has a classroom that is full of your Title I students, your children on free and reduced lunch, your immigrant students, and a healthy number of special ed students. So she, in essence, is working with the students that are experiencing the greatest amount of difficulty in the classroom. So she says to me, "Dad, how can I move on with the pacing guide when it's very clear and obvious to me that these children are not learning and are not keeping up? So why am I moving them forward when it's obvious and evident that they're not keeping up, that they haven't learned the basics in order for them to advance?" And that is a frustration that we know, I'm sure, and you know, you're aware of, that many of our teachers face, that they're being forced to push the kids forward even though the children are not ready. So rather than taking a step back and going to the competency-based model that says that child will not move on until they have achieved competency in this particular skill, proven the fact that they have competency, and then they can move on, we continue to force children forward. This is part of the reason why children are left behind. This is part of the problem where, in spite of the fact that we had all of those years of No Child Left Behind as the federal legislation, we weren't able to close the achievement gap because we continue to force children to move forward in spite of the fact that they have not gained competency in the basic skills that they need before they're allowed to move forward. This is something that we need to think of and we need to correct. Along with the competency-based idea is the concept of continuous progress in education. And here again, this is something that applies to all of the students. Okay? If we move to this competency-based model where the children are allowed to move as they achieve competency, we're basically allowing them to move at their own pace. And when we do that, we can have continuous progress in education. What that means, in essence, is that children like the ones in my daughter's class who need more time to achieve competency get it, but also the children that have the ability and the competency to move quickly through their work can advance at a faster pace. So you have then, depending on the ability level of the children, the opportunity for children to move quickly through the curriculum or for children to take whatever time they need in order to establish competency. Now, the digital education that is so much a part of our classrooms today can play a significant role in moving towards this form of personalized education. We know, and you hear it, I'm sure, and I certainly do, complaints from all sectors that say, you know, computers in the classroom are not the answer. You know, the computer companies are trying to sell school districts as, you know, every child should have a computer. It's a lot of money that's being wasted because that's not the solution. That isn't the solution. The computer in every classroom and a child with a computer in every classroom, that is not the solution. The solution, though, is that we have a technology that can support and be very effective in personalizing education. Obviously, one of the difficulties as I talk about personalized education and competency-based education, as we all recognized immediately, is that the way we're organized for learning today is the teacher in the classroom with the youngsters in their class, and in most cases, let's say we're talking an average of 25 students per class. Depending on the district and the wealth of the district, it could be over 30 or it could be less than 20. But in any case, it's a significant number of students who are in that classroom, and the teacher has to deal with all of them. And to do that, the individualized instruction for each and every child in the classroom when it's just the teacher and that number of students is very difficult. That's where the technology comes in. With the technology that exists today, it is possible for teachers to begin to develop those individualized, personalized programs for their students where the computer is a valuable asset and a valuable assistant to the teacher, where the teacher is able to provide students with work on the computer, with programs on the computer that are at their level of instruction, and the student can work independently with the teacher walking around the room, looking over their shoulder, providing assistance as they need it, but the students has the opportunity to move at their own pace, to learn material that is appropriate to their ability. We know that there's a wealth of online courses there. This is really more applicable to the high school level, where the youngsters are more mature. And we know that in the majority already of high schools throughout America, that the students have the opportunity now to take online courses. When I was the superintendent of Fairfax County in the late 90s and early 2000s, even back then, we're talking close to 20 years ago, we were already developing online courses for our high school students and allowing high school students really to take an online course. But we know what has become more popular today is this concept of blended learning, where it's not just allowing a student to take a course online independently with a teacher online as well guiding the lesson, to in the classroom at the high school, the student working on these online programs while the teacher, as is the case when we talk about personalized learning, has the opportunity to provide individual support and assistance to the kids in the class. So online courses, the digital learning the technology is certainly an enabler and a support mechanism if we move towards this concept of personalizing education. Another concept that we need to focus on it is again a throwback to the 20th century, if not earlier, is this concept of seat time requirements. As we've been talking about online courses and blended learning, we begin to see that it is not necessary for the student to be in the classroom every period, every day in order to be learning. That there is the possibility for the students learning outside of the classroom and not being in the class. So the concept that is prevalent in so many states that still require, particularly at the high school level, for a student to be in class a certain number of periods throughout the year in order to get credit for the course is a problem. Because as we know, there have been instances of students who say, hey, give me the final exam. I have only been in class 50 or 60% of the time, but I can pass that final exam in that particular course because I know the subject. But with the seat time requirement, that's not permissible. That's not allowed. The student has to be there, and even if they are capable of passing that final exam in the course, they will not get credit because they didn't meet the seat time requirements. So that's an issue that we have to confront and we have to deal with at the secondary levels for sure. As we go back to the idea of discussing, again, this competency-based personalized learning, the technology that is part of the process, one of the things that we see now that's emerging that has incredible potential for the future is adaptive learning. So you're aware that there are now programs that as the student is involved in going through the program adapts to the student. So it's basically a process of information being provided to the student, and then in essence an assessment, a quiz if you would, that would demonstrate that the student has internalized the concept, understands the concept, and based on that feedback, that information between the student and the computer, the program now adapts and goes on to a higher level. Or if the student is showing that they have not been able to learn the material, the computer adapts in the reverse direction. And now goes back to providing additional information that hopefully will allow the student to actually capture and understand the concept that is being taught. So this adaptive learning process in many of the programs that we're beginning to see in our schools is incredibly powerful and has incredible potential. Same thing as the computer as an interactive teaching device. We all have the gadgets in our home, Alexa, Siri, whatever we call it, that we now interact with, where we by voice ask questions, ask for information, and we get that information back. Well, as you can imagine, there are programs that are being developed that are interactive, that really almost allow the student to have a conversation with the computer, if you will, in getting a lot of this information. This is scary to some, even to teachers, who say, oh my God, technology is going to do away with my job. I'm not going to have a job because a student will be able to sit in front of a computer, interact with that computer, and get all the information they need. Well, that's not true. We know that. We understand that. We know the importance of the teacher in the classroom. We know how important it is to have that human being involved with the student for more ways than one. There's a lot of dealing nowadays with social emotional development, and the fact that there are other things besides the academics that are part of being in school and part of learning. So the teacher will always have a role in the education process, and it's a significant and will continue to be a significant component of the teaching learning process. But the reality is that just as with the digital transformation, moving towards interactive computers, again, is just a more powerful supportive mechanism for the teacher in working with the students and what they need. And then just following this to its normal conclusion is the concept of artificial intelligence. And that's, again, powerful. You know, you can read the stories in the papers that talk about computers now that are so intelligent that they can beat the master chess players, that they can solve problems that the most knowledgeable and intelligent individuals in a particular field are not able to solve. Artificial intelligence is here and is yet another step towards this growth in technology that has a lot of people concerned. There's no question about it, because it is scary when you think about it. When you think about a computer being able to absorb so many more times the amount of information that the human brain can possibly absorb. Yet this is a reality, and when you combine the artificial intelligence with the computer, with the interactive computer, it certainly begins to provide an insight into the future and what potentially could happen that can scare us because it's so different from what we do now. But the reality is that these things are here. They're happening. And we are not, in education, really reaching out and embracing these tools to really improve education as we know it today. Now, so all of these things are movements that would transform education. And with the principal and the superintendents working together, discussing these things, talking about these things, how can we make these things happen? With the principals providing the insight, the practicality. Hey, in my school, this would be great to do it, but I just don't have the resources. I don't have the potential. I don't have the interest on the part of my teachers. And the superintendent there saying, well, if this is something that we agree on and we feel that it's important to do it, what kind of support can I give you? How can we work together so that I can provide the resources that you need, you let me know what those resources are, and jointly we can create the kind of team effort that will move us forward to the kind of education and the kind of instruction that can be so much more powerful than the traditional programs that we have in place today. This begins to create that bond between the principal and the superintendent, as jointly they analyze the problems, they see what the potential solutions might be, and they begin the process of moving forward to solve them. So along with that then is this concept of jointly creating a climate hospitable to education. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we create that? Again, when we go back to that 1902 classroom, just like we saw the 1902 Wright brothers airplane, and you see the classroom as it was then. Other than the way these students look and the way they're dressed, and the kind of desks that they have in the classroom, and the fact that they're all facing forward, they're still in a room, and they're still in a room together. And that room, to many educators today, is still seen as the only source of learning. And of course we know that that is far from the truth. The modern classroom today is certainly built more around this concept of small group instruction, certainly in places in schools and classrooms where personalized learning is actually in effect. You see the students just scattered around individually or in very small groups working together. So the modern classroom has certainly changed from what it was in 1902, but however, it's still tied to that edifice complex, the notion that learning can only take place in the classroom. Seat time requirements. If you're not in your classroom and you're not in your class for whatever period of time is mandated, well then guess what? You're just not going to get credit from that course. But we see today that given the reality of the technology that is available, that learning takes place everywhere. Learning can take place anywhere, as long as the students have the tools, the laptop, the iPad, whatever it is that they need in order to access the information that they need to access in order for them to move forward. Here again, this is where that relationship between the principal and the superintendent becomes key. This is where the principal and the superintendent say, how can I make that happen? How can I individualize education? How can I turn my back on seat time requirements when it is a reality? Yes, that is a major issue. In many cases, the superintendents then have the role of being the advocates that will move to the state level, or whatever the level is, the authority level is, that's requiring these rules and regulations that prevent changes in education from happening, to move forward on behalf and with the principals together to say these things have to change. These things are not appropriate anymore in our settings. What can we do to make a difference, in the hopes that at some point we'll say goodbye to this edifice complex. There are, by the way, a number of states already that have instituted rules and regulations at the state level, for example, that allow the schools to claim a day of instruction on, let's say, a snow day, when the children are not allowed to go, are not capable or able to go to school because of the weather. And yet, because the district has the technology and the capacity for students to continue their learning at home, there are states now that will provide credit for that day, even though the district is closed because of inclement weather. There are districts around the country right now, for example, where in rural areas students have distances to travel to go to and from school, in some cases an hour or more, where the wireless capability on the bus allow the students to go online and continue to learn, can do their homework on the way home, or finish their homework on the way to school, or prepare for the test, or take advantage of these kinds of challenges that have to do with the school edifice, the school structure as we know it. Another concept that the principal and the superintendent can work on together is this notion, again, of grade levels. We know from the history of education that it was Horace Mann in the 1800s that went on his honeymoon to Austria, and while in Austria, because he had been very active in the education in Massachusetts, learned about the grade level concept from kindergarten to 12th grade. And what a neat way back in the 1800s this would be of organizing classrooms as American education began to slowly move from the one-room schoolhouse to the more institutional school as a result of the Industrial Revolution, where there are hundreds of kids in a building. And how could we manage and organize these students in a more effective manner? Well, we organize them by age. So if you're 5 years old, you're in kindergarten. If you're 6-year-old, you're in the first grade. If you're 7, you're in the second grade, and so on. Well, here we are, folks. It's 2018, and we're still organizing the same way. We still have grade levels that are tied to the age of the child, rather than organizing the children along their ability levels, and for depending on the area, as it changes, depending on the student. So we're still doing that. Attempts have been made in schools around the country, in areas, to do away with grade levels as we know them, but it's a tough thing to do. I try to do it in a number of my districts, the last one being Fairfax County, and I have to tell you, I had a terrible problem because I would go to one of the schools that we're doing, and I would be accosted by a parent who would say to me, Dr. Domenech, I really like, what's happening in my class, my kid, et cetera, but what grade is my child in? It was very important. And then, of course, we know that we still have regulations that require testing of the students at specific grade levels. And so when they're in that grade, they have to be tested at that particular time, whether the student is capable of dealing with the test, either because they're behind and we know what the outcome is going to be, or the student is way ahead of it. And for them going through this test process, it's just a waste of their time, but it's part of our accountability system. So here again, yet another area where there is tremendous opportunity for the principal and the superintendent. I can tell you that as I have attempted these things in the districts where I have been superintendent, that again, I was able to find the principals that raised their hands and said, yes, that's something that I would love to try. I would love to work with you on that. And we would do that, and we would create these pilot school districts where they would have non-graded situation, where they would have, by the way, year-round schooling, which is something that we're going to talk just for a little bit as we move forward. And then, of course, the agrarian calendar. Here's another example of a throwback to the 18th century that we still have in many of our states. School that begins in September and ends in June, and the kids are off school July and August, ostensibly because during July and August they would be home to help the picking of the crop, whatever that crop happened to be. Well, that's if that was ever the case, who knows? But the reality is that we're all aware of the loss of learning that takes place in those 2 months when the children are away from school for 2 entire months. And they come back to school in September, and they have to go through this whole process of relearning what they forgot since June, as opposed to a calendar that would be year-round, that would allow the students to stay engaged, that would allow the students to move forward without constantly having to refresh their memories and relearn things that they had learned in the past. Because that's the way that we are organized. There are districts in states that are beginning school now in early August, but it's still instead of September through June, it's August through May, and you still basically have that same 2-month vacation in the summertime. Now, I tried this as a superintendent. I tried the year-round calendars, and here again, it was a huge problem with parents who, and certainly the kids who wanted their 2-month vacation, but the parents who wanted their vacation, the teachers who wanted their vacation, because we've always done it that way, and that's how we do it. And by the way, that raises the point, are we doing things that's in the best interest of the kids, or are we doing things because it's in the best interest of the adults? And I think that's a legitimate question that can be posed here. But there are year-round school programs that have developed, and I think that this is a direction that we're going to be seeing more and more in the not-too-distant future. Then there's the working together, the principal and the superintendent, to cultivate leadership in others, because the superintendent has a responsibility to mentor, to coach the principals, and provide them the opportunities to grow and to learn, so that they can then rise to the challenge that they need to work on together. So there are different ways to approach that. One of them obviously is empowering people, and superintendents need to empower their principals. To listen to their ideas, to listen to their creative suggestions, and say, that sounds like a great idea. That's certainly in line with the mission that we've been discussing of our schools. And yes, I'm going to support your doing that. Go ahead and do it. That is just an incredible bond that can be created between the principal and the superintendent when the principal is empowered to make decisions and to move ahead And then there's that bond because, hey, together we fail or together we succeed, but it's together. And so empowering people is very important. And so is inspiring. The superintendent needs to be the inspiring educational leader for the principal, just as the principal needs to be the inspiring leader at the school level. So inspiring by bringing in thought leaders, by bringing in speakers into the meetings with the principals, into the meetings with staff that will inspire individuals to think in terms of doing what is really in the best interest of the kids. And then, of course, leading for change. That's hard to do. Leading for change is hard to do. I have a sign that you can't see right here in my office, but it says, the manager has eyes on the bottom line. The leader has eyes on the horizon. I think we've all gone through the graduate level courses where we've talked about the difference between managing and the difference about leading. There's no question that the principal, as the superintendent, that they have to be exceptional managers. They have to be able to control the operation. They have to be able to ensure that everything's in place, that every student has a desk, that the buses run on time, that the lunch program is doing what it needs to do, that the building facility is maintained the way it needs to be maintained. Those are management function. But the leadership function, to bring about the kinds of changes that I've been talking about and others that may be desirable, that requires leadership. That requires the inspiring leader that will have people following as opposed to managers who will push people to try to do what they want them to do. And of course, the fourth component that we see here is that shared vision. How important it is that this be a shared vision. I can tell you that I would never push down on my principles an idea that was not shared. I would not force a principal to do a year-round school. I would not force a principal to personalize learning unless it was something that the principal says, yes, I like that, I want to try that, I want to do that, and it was a shared vision. To try to shove things down people's throat doesn't work, and it certainly does not help create the kind of relationship between the principal and the superintendent that is so essential for the success that we've been talking about. So when we talk about the changes that need to take place and some of the kinds of things that we're doing, we need to, as educational leaders, as superintendents, as the principals in the schools, begin to look at teachers in a very different way. Right now, we look at it generally as the teacher is the sage on the stage, when in essence, they need to be the guide on the side. I can tell you that here at AASA, we have a sizable cohort of superintendents around the country that are personalizing learning. And that cohort is growing significantly. We have well over 100 school systems around the country that are personalizing learning. And when we go to those situations and we walk into the classrooms, and you walk into a classroom, you see the teacher in a very, very different role. Rarely do you see a teacher in front of a room lecturing the class. Generally, what you see are the students grouped individually or small groups. You see the teacher walking around the room, sitting with the students, in essence, supporting them, helping them, mentoring them, coaching them, but certainly not lecturing them. They are indeed the guide on the side. And that's a significant change for teachers. But I have to tell you that the teachers that I speak to when I go to see these programs love it because it frees them from that concept of developing the lecture that they're going to be giving next day and the day after that and the day after that and focusing more on the individual students and the kind of support that they need to provide their students because they know their students and what their students need. It's a whole different way of teaching and learning. But again, to make this a reality, just as we talk about the partnership that is so necessary between the principal and the superintendent, there is the necessary engagement of other constituents in the community. Certainly the staff. First and foremost, a superintendent and a principal that agree on moving in a particular direction in their district, then they know that the next step is the staff, and how they're going to work with the staff, educate the staff, allow the staff to express their concerns, see who is really excited about it, who is not, before moving forward with any of these initiatives. And clearly, parents are very important. Parents matter tremendously. So the parents have also to be educated, and the parents also have to be brought into these discussions. And here again, the superintendent and the principal jointly need to provide these arguments, to provide these points and say, this is why we're looking to do these things, and gain the support of the parents that they can move forward. And once you have that in place and you feel good about it, of course the Board of Education is key here, because it's the Board of Education who will ultimately have to make a decision to say, yes, we're going to move in this particular direction. So these are critical points that are important here. Here again, I mentioned this before, that management consists of controlling a group or a set of entities to accomplish a goal, while leadership refers to an individual's ability to influence, motivate, enable others to contribute toward organizational success. Influence and inspiration separate leaders from managers, not power and not control. So this is something where the superintendent and the principal working together have the opportunity to separate the functions. Again, management is critical. It's not something that we would ignore, but to separate the management and the leadership functions, for the superintendent to be a mentor, to be inspirational, to be a coach in working with the principals and providing the principals, again, with exposure to these ideas, exposure to the training that we hope will take place, that will allow the principal to move forward and be successful. I do want to allow some time for questions. I do see that I have some here. There's one that says, from my experience, what is the most important trait or skill superintendents look for in selecting a principal for a school? Well, I have to tell you that from my experience in 27 years, and I'm proud of the principals that worked for me, what I looked first and foremost was for an individual that made me feel that the most important thing here was for the welfare of the students that were going to be under their tutelage as principals. That everything really came around the welfare of the students and what was best for the students. I was not impressed by a principal who came in and told me that they had this fantastic ability to do scheduling, to route the buses, to how the cafeteria worked, and those are wonderful things. But if I did not see, if I didn't feel, if I didn't get from the principal that fact that they were passionate about the students that they were going to serve in their school, and that everything revolved about doing what was best for the principal, if that was not there, I was not interested in having them as a principal. And there are any number of principals that worked for me that still come up to me and said, Dr. Domenech, I remember when you interviewed me, and you know what it was that you were looking for. I was so nervous, and it was very apparent what you were looking for, and I'm glad, because it allowed me then to be the kind of principal that I wanted to be. So those are the kinds of principals that I wanted. I wanted caring, loving, concerned leaders, not necessarily managers. Although obviously the management component was part of it, but for me it was not the most important skill that I wanted to see on the part of the principals. Another question is, what do I see as the greatest challenge in the superintendent-principal relationship? I think the greatest challenge in that relationship is where there is disagreement between what the superintendent sees as the mission and the way forward, and a principal that doesn't necessarily see that. It's very difficult then for the two of them to be able to work together in the kind of partnership that I've been talking about and hopefully demonstrating as we talked about these great changes and transformation of our schools from the way that they are to the way that they should be. Because if you have that disagreement right off the bat, you're never going to get that cooperation, that collaboration between the two that is very important. Now, having said that, I go back to the point that the superintendent has a duty in working with the principal to try to show the principal why these things are important, to allow the principal to see where these things are happening and working, and answer their questions, and try to do the very best they can to ensure that the principal buys into the particular concept. And here again, where you have more than one school, as many of us do, if that becomes a point where it's not going to happen, and the principal is still the kind of individual that should be leading a school, then the superintendent's fine. Then let's move on to the other principals that may want to do these kinds of things that you don't necessarily do. And by the way, what tends to happen when you do that is that when there is this one principal who becomes the front runner in a particular thing and doing what they're doing actually works, then you have the other principals come around and say, hey, okay, I'm ready to try this. I'm ready to do this because I see that it can work. Question, what if my superintendent isn't interested in a joint relationship? What should the principal do? Well, if you have a superintendent that's not interested in a joint relationship, then that superintendent shouldn't be there, plain and simple. A superintendent that feels that, they're the king of the hill and this is the way it's going to be, you do it my way or the highway, that's not going to work. There's, many of you are aware of the fact that the tenure of the superintendent, depending on the district, if it's an urban district, it's about 3 years. If it's a suburban or rural district, it actually doubles to about 6 years. But the tenure of the superintendent is not very long. The superintendent has a very tough job, and a superintendent that demonstrates that they don't have the interest in establishing a collaborative relationship with the principal is a superintendent that's not going to last very long. Because if they're doing that with their key players, you can imagine what they're doing with parents, what they're doing with staff, what they're doing with other members of the community. And it's only a matter of time before things really turn on them. And that could be a problem. I don't see any other questions. Oh, yeah. How do I, as a principal, get my superintendent to support me? Here again, I think certainly by going to your superintendent, expressing, I had that, by the way. I had many of my principals who came to me with ideas. A lot of the ideas that we actually wound up implementing in our schools weren't mine. They came from the principals who came to me and said, I'd like to do this. I'd like to try this. Would I support them? And I said, absolutely. So it's important for the principal, of course, just as the superintendent has to make his or her case in terms of what they want to do, the principal has to make his or her case to the superintendent in terms of wanting to do what they want to do, to lay out the plan, why they want to do it, how they're going to do it, and impress the superintendent that this is doable. But that should be the first step to approach the superintendent and try to gain their support. What strategies would you give for a principal to work with the superintendent to transform their school? Here again, you have a principal that has a particular problem. Let's say that you have a school where the majority of your students are on Title I, the majority of your students are special ed, they're immigrants, you basically have a low socioeconomic population, and there are things that you want to do for your students that go beyond just achievement, because you recognize that these are the students that require the kind of wraparound services, because these kids are not coming to school ready to learn. They're not coming to school ready to learn. So you as a principal go to your superintendent and you say, hey, we certainly want these youngsters to perform the best that they can perform. But the reality is that these kids need support. They need assistance. And unless I'm taking care of their needs, these things are not going to happen. And I have researched and I have found that there are programs like Communities in Schools, that there are other supportive programs out there that will help me with these things. And I've talked to these people and they're willing to come into our schools and help me. Would you support me in doing that? I think a superintendent would have a very difficult time saying no, because first of all, you're demonstrating that you're there for the kids, that you're looking to do the very best thing that's possible for these kids, that you've researched the situation, that you've identified solutions, and you're willing to bring these things to the table. I think you're making a tremendously positive argument, and the superintendent, if they're listening to you, will definitely support you. And again, that will establish just a wonderful relationship.
Dan, we have time for one last question, and that is, what advice do you have for new superintendents working with veteran principals where there is not a common vision?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, Anna, because as you know, we do here at AASA a lot of superintendent training. We have our National Superintendent Certification Program, and we have our Aspiring Superintendent Program that is, of course, spitting out a lot of our new superintendents. And one of the things that we counsel these emerging leaders to be as they walk into a school situation is, oh my God, your veteran principals are a tremendous resource. And those are the folks you have to meet with. Those are the folks you have to talk to. Those are the folks that you have to listen to learn. If they're coming in from outside the community, as is often the case with superintendents, to learn more about the community, to learn more about the school, and to learn about what are the practices that these veteran principals who've been there for such a long time feel are important. If the superintendent says, well, you know, I just went through this AASA program, and they're telling me that these are the kinds, well, Dan Domenech says that I need to go out there and personalize learning, and the principal, the veteran principal said, that's a wonderful idea, and that's something that we'd love to do, but I can tell you right now that our teachers are not ready for that. Well, you know, it's important for that superintendent to listen to that and to say, okay, then if we wanted to move in this direction, what are the things that you suggest we ought to think about begin doing in order to move forward? So to find that middle ground so that you can reach understanding and consensus that this is the direction that we want to take. Again, because the bottom line is that we're both interested in doing what is really best for our kids.
Thank you, Dan. That wraps it up for this afternoon's webinar session on building effective principal and superintendent relationships. Thank you, Dan, on behalf of NAESP and AASA audiences. It's been a very interactive and wonderful session this afternoon.